Kean Ward never saw himself as reckless. He saw himself as corrective. For years, he had watched institutions polish their public image while burying uncomfortable truths beneath legal language and strategic silence. Sable wasn't built for chaos. It was built for exposure. Controlled, deliberate exposure. When the first anonymous data packets about Brightwell Youth Services began appearing in their encrypted Dropbox, Kean didn't rush to publish. He studied. Donation reports that didn't align. Vendor payments that looped through shell-like intermediaries. Emails hinting at audits being handled internally. It wasn't an open confession of corruption, but it was enough to smell something wrong. Nix immediately began mapping financial irregularities against public procurement records. Moth combed quietly through metadata without commentary. Rin, the newest member, encouraged momentum, pointing out how high-profile accountability would force deeper investigation. Kean weighed the risks. Brightwell was beloved. Trusted. That was exactly why the truth would matter more. When he finally approved the breach and release, he believed he was aiming at power. He didn't realize he was standing exactly where someone else wanted him. The entry point came easier than expected. A neglected third-party admin panel tied to an outdated vendor contract provided access without resistance. It was the kind of oversight large organizations make when bureaucracy grows thicker than oversight. Rin handled the infiltration smoothly, routing through layers of obfuscation that kept Sable's identity concealed. Nix extracted financial spreadsheets and internal email threads. Moth preserved server snapshots to confirm authenticity. Kean monitored from his apartment, the glow of 3 monitors reflecting in his eyes as data streamed in. Most of it was mundane. Administrative noise. But woven inside were inconsistencies, routing numbers tied to unfamiliar accounts, payment approvals. Bypassing standard review channels. And then there were the emails. Phrases about keeping audits friendly. Instructions to redirect inquiries. It looked like smoke. Smoke implied fire. But in the flood of information, 1 or 2 timestamps didn't align with internal server patterns. Kean noticed. He hesitated. Then he dismissed it as clerical error. That decision would haunt him later. When Sable released the curated leak package, it spread like oxygen meeting flame. Screenshots of internal emails circulated within minutes. Influencers dissected the files live. Commentators declared Brightwell corrupt before official statements were even drafted. Outrage accelerated faster than fact-checking ever could. Within 48 hours, authorities announced an internal IT administrator was under investigation. His name was Luis Ortega. His image appeared beside headlines that used words like fraud and conspiracy. Kean watched the narrative lock into place. It was too clean. The system had found a villain almost immediately. The speed unsettled him. But momentum had already carried the story beyond control. Nix was the first to say it out loud. Something felt wrong. A vendor identification number embedded in the leak didn't match regulatory formatting standards. An email header routed through a server configuration that Brightwell didn't use. A PDF document listed a software author tag that belonged to a different internal system. Individually, these were minor discrepancies. Together, they formed a pattern that didn't fit. Moth reran hash verifications. Some files shared identical creation timestamps down to the second despite being months apart. That wasn't oversight. That was fabrication. The realization settled in slowly. Someone had inserted forged documents into otherwise legitimate data. The most inflammatory evidence, the pieces that fueled the outrage, were the least authentic. Sable hadn't simply exposed corruption. They had amplified a planted narrative. Kean resisted the conclusion at first. Brightwell still had questionable financial patterns. The irregularities weren't entirely fictional. But the story the public believed, the viral version, was built on the forged core. And Luis Ortega was facing legal action fueled by that perception. Kian sat in his apartment staring at scrolling feeds, feeling something unfamiliar creeping in. Not fear of exposure. Not fear of arrest. Fear of having been used. The difference between exposing truth and weaponizing distortion was thinner than he had ever admitted. Digging deeper into past scandals, Kian began cross-referencing public outrage events with municipal contract transitions. He noticed a troubling rhythm. Several nonprofits had collapsed after similar digital exposures. Each time, city contracts quietly shifted to private service providers with indirect ties to a reputation defense firm called Harrogate. Harrogate specialized in crisis containment and public narrative management. They rarely appeared in headlines. But they always appeared in aftermaths. It wasn't about destroying organizations. It was about destabilizing them long enough to redirect control. Server audit logs revealed a login session inside Sable's encrypted environment from an unfamiliar geographic origin. The credentials used belonged to Rin. The silence that followed that discovery was heavier than accusation. Rin's explanations were calm, technically plausible, but incomplete. Kian realized infiltration didn't require open sabotage. It required influence. Rin had encouraged urgency. Encouraged framing the narrative for maximum impact. Encouraged speed over patience. None of it looked malicious at the time. Now it looked strategic. Nix located a neglected Harrogate staging server containing campaign templates. Inside were documents labeled by strategy categories: narrative amplification, activist leverage, media injection timing. One folder mirrored the Brightwell storyline almost precisely. It outlined how to seed forged documentation within legitimate leaks to steer interpretation. Another detailed methods for embedding digital assets into decentralized activist groups to accelerate controlled exposure. Sable wasn't the mastermind. They were the delivery system. Kian drove past Brightwell's office and saw families lined outside waiting for services that had been paused. Parents held paperwork in their hands, confused about program cancellations. Staff members looked overwhelmed. The consequences weren't theoretical. They were visible. Outrage had damaged something real. And the system that benefited from that damage remained untouched. For the first time, Kian questioned whether exposure without precision was just another form of collateral damage. Rin reached out privately. They admitted being recruited by Harrogate years earlier under the guise of digital threat mitigation. Their role was to integrate into activist networks and guide narratives toward pre-selected targets. Brightwell had been marked for destabilization ahead of a municipal contract reallocation. Rin claimed they hadn't anticipated the speed or scale of fallout. Whether that was guilt or survival instinct, Kian couldn't tell. But the architecture of manipulation was now undeniable. Rin provided coordinates for a private meeting between Harrogate executives, Brightwell board members, and city procurement officials. Instead of detonating the information publicly, Kian forwarded it anonymously to investigative journalists and watchdog groups. This time the exposure moved slowly. Verified sources. Confirmed documents. Structural analysis. The difference between outrage and evidence was patience. Harrogate responded predictably. A smear campaign labeled Sable extremists targeting charitable institutions. Fabricated manifestos circulated. Social media bots amplified disinformation. The goal wasn't to disprove facts. It was to flood the space until the truth felt indistinguishable from noise. Weeks later, a detailed investigative article mapped the financial ties between Harrogate and contract reallocations. It explained how digital outrage could be engineered to redirect public trust and funding. Sable was mentioned briefly, not as heroes, but as exploited intermediaries. It was humbling. It was necessary. Evidence of forged metadata reached Luis Ortega's legal defense. Charges weakened. Public attention had already drifted elsewhere, but the correction mattered. Quiet justice rarely trends. Sable changed. Verification layers multiplied. Emotional framing was stripped from release drafts. Nix slowed down. Moth remained precise. Kian embraced restraint as discipline rather than weakness. Rin disappeared from all communication channels. No farewell. No trace. In organizations like Harrogate, assets rarely exit cleanly. The absence said enough. Harrogate adjusted operations quietly. Contracts were reviewed publicly but realigned privately. Systems absorbed shock. They rarely collapse outright. Kian understood something now that he hadn't before: exposure is not inherently justice. It is leverage. And leverage can be redirected by whoever anticipates the reaction best. Sable became methodical. Fewer drops. More corroboration. Less virality. More endurance. The audience shrank. The credibility grew. Months later, the envelope arrived. A photograph of a meeting room. Rin visible in the background. 5 words printed on the back: next time, aim better. It wasn't a threat. It was a lesson. Kian stared at the message and understood fully. In digital warfare, the most dangerous mistake isn't silence. It's striking the wrong target and believing you've won. Next time, he would verify not just the data, but who benefited from its release.